In It's a Wonderful Life, we get the story of George Bailey, played by the wonderful actor Jimmy Stewart. And George Bailey, it's very safe to say in the film, has lost his way when we first see him. George begins his journey through life going about and doing what we all do, just living and trying to figure out what the next step is. And somehow he finds himself falling into this role of leading the local building and loan business. And it's as he begins to lead this business that he tries to do good. He tries to be altruistic. He tries to do things to better the community around him. And oftentimes, he succeeds in that. But then there's some very difficult financial issues. And all of a sudden, George's focus has changed. And it takes really divine intervention to prevent George from doing the worst things he could possibly do for his own life and for those around him who love him. But thanks to this divine intervention, George is able to find his way back to doing what's good, not just for himself, but for his family and for the town, his community around him. George lost his way for a little bit. He had every intention of doing good and somehow found himself down the wrong path just for a little bit of time. Unfortunately, we see the same thing with the Israelites in our readings this morning. In our first reading, the reading from the book of Nehemiah, we see the Israelites returning home after years and years of exile. The Israelites, first in the northern kingdom, then in the southern kingdom, were taken away by the larger empires around them. First the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, and then the southern kingdom by the Babylonians. But then, under the Persians, they're allowed to return home. And now the Israelites have a determination. Because as we see through the Tanakh, the Old Testament, throughout their time, the Israelites went away from following God and instead chased after false idols. And so now that they are home once again, the Israelites are determined to make sure this never happens to them again, that they never go through another exile. And to do that, they turn to the law. They turn to the law that God has given them through Torah. And in turning to that law, their hope is to do all those things they weren't doing before, to do all those things to help make sure they don't stray again. This is a good thing for them to do. It's a good impulse to try to make sure that they are close in their relationship with God. But unfortunately, in following the law, they take it just a little bit too far. As we see at the very end of the book of Nehemiah, beyond what we read today, they take this sense of following the law so far that they decide to get rid of their foreign wives, not thinking about what's going to happen to these wives when they do so. And in fact, the book of Ruth is written in response to this action. The book of Ruth was meant to show that foreign wives are not all that bad, and that, in fact, King David, the great King David, had a foreigner, a Gentile, in his ancestry, Ruth herself. Unfortunately, this trend of the Israelites of following the law with the right intentions but going too far in the wrong direction doesn't stop here. In Jesus' day, we heard in our gospel reading, the same gospel we read for St. Luke's Day, our feast day. We see Jesus opening up the scroll of Isaiah and reading from that prophet. The words that Jesus has to offer from the prophet Isaiah, they're not about following the law. They're not about living into a sense of righteousness or rule following. No, instead, what Jesus is calling on the others to do, those around him to do, is to look to the poor. He speaks to those who are captive, who are blind. He speaks to those who need to hear these words, to those who need to be healed, restored, freed even. Unfortunately, as we will see next week in our gospel lesson, Jesus' words fall on deaf ears, and more than just deaf ears. The people of Nazareth, the town he grew up in, try to chase him literally off a cliff. And of course, we know that the leaders of the people in his time will eventually be the ones to put Jesus to death. While they were trying to follow the law, the people around Jesus unfortunately made it an idol. And they forgot what the true purpose of the law is. The very thing that we said at the beginning of this service, that we say at the beginning of all of our services. The two great commandments, the summary of the law. The point of the law is to help the people to love God with all their very being. And, as we see in the words that Jesus says, the words he read from the prophet Isaiah, our call too is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Unfortunately, in this thread, we see the Israelites continuing, though with the best intentions, to follow the wrong path. Our hope, though, is that we see characters like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life doing the same thing. And yes, it takes divine intervention. But George Bailey is eventually able to find his way back to the path that he intended to be on. That he's able to come back to the root of his good intentions. Fortunately for us, we have a miracle as well. And that miracle's name is Jesus Christ. If we can do what those in Nazareth couldn't, if we can keep our ears open to what it is that Jesus is saying to us, then maybe, just maybe, we can come back from whatever good intentions we may have had and have fallen away from. Because those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. What are those good intentions that we've had that we've fallen away from? And what are the ways in which Jesus wishes us to return from the direction we're going and go back to the original intentions that he has had for us? We can only do that through the miracle of Jesus. As we learned last week, we can only do that with the Spirit of God in our lives. And so to be able to come back, to be able to once again get at the root of our good intentions, we should be there with our Lord, listening at his feet to hear what it is that Jesus has to say to us, to hear what it is that Jesus would have us do, would have us return to. In this way, we can return from our falling, from those good intentions. And like people like George Bailey, come back to the person that God has intended us to be.